The Baltimore Program. On May 6, 1942, Extraordinary Zionist Conference, New York. Its theme, Jews could no longer depend upon Britain to establish a national home in Palestine. Yeah, a majority of the delegates were committed to the establishment of Palestine as a Jewish Commonwealth, as well as an end to all immigration restrictions. The huge British Empire, unable to do what tiny little Israel could do on its own efforts with God's chosen people. Guess who's behind that? Churchill's memorandum. We have certainly treated the Arabs very well, having installed King Faisal and his descendants upon the throne of Iraq and maintained them there. Having maintained the Emir Abdullah in Transjordania, and having asserted the rights of self-government for the Arabs and other inhabitants of Syria. With the exception of Ibn Saud and the Emir Abdullah, both of whom have been good and faithful followers, the Arabs have been virtually of no use to us in the present war. Matter of fact, they took opposing point of view, this opposing side. They have taken no part in the fighting except insofar as they were involved in the Iraq rebellion against us. Ha! They have created no claims upon the Allies should we be victorious. In the British House of Commons, pressure continued to try to create an Allied open door for those refugees who did manage to escape. Despite the preoccupations with the conduct of the war, Churchill had continued to support the idea of an eventual Jewish national home in Palestine with a Jewish majority. But as the war progressed, he had begun to accept the arguments which the Peel Commission had put forward before the war, and which many Jews had also accepted, albeit reluctantly, in favor of two separate states in Palestine, one Arab and one Jewish. What do you think God thinks of that? The Irgun Jewish Terrorism Organization is formed. Inside Palestine, a tiny group of desperate Jews felt unable either to trust Britain's word or to wait until the war was over. Calling themselves the Irgun Zavai Lumai, the national military organization, and holding Japinski as their inspiration, in January 1944, they called upon the Jews of Palestine to revolt. Their demand was immediate transfer of power in Eretz Israel to a provisional Hebrew government, their method expressed succinctly by their leader, Menachem Begin. In his memoirs, the revolt was a prolonged campaign of destruction. Jewish terrorism had broken out against the British in Palestine. Lord Moyne was assassinated in Cairo by two young Jews. On the other hand, the deliberate murder of Europe's Jews was reaching its terrible climax, with more than 5 million Jews having been already perished and hundreds of thousands more being murdered every month. For the British policymakers, however, the overriding concern still seemed to remain that of the Jewish refugees seeking to reach Palestine. From Palestine itself, despite the intense bitterness created by the anti-refugee policy, 33,000 Jews enlisted in the British Army, compared with a total of 9,000 Arabs. Long before the end of the war, this total was reduced by at least one-half through desertions and discharges. The Jewish death toll will never be fully known. Among the 1.5 million children who were murdered were many whose names were never recorded. Hundreds of thousands of individuals whose names are found before the war in lists of doctors, nurses, and teachers, students or lawyers, writers or poets disappeared without a trace. Only God knows, and that's the only one who counts anyway. In the Nazi lists of those deported by train to the concentration camps, tens of thousands from as far away as France, Belgium, Italy, or Greece are many whose exact fate is unknown. That they were murdered is certain. 6 million is the million figure of those who perished. Closing the door, justice and revolt, 1945 to 46. We know how World War II worked out in the end. With the end of the war in Europe on May 8, 1945, Jews all over the world hoped and expected that the doors of Palestine would finally be opened for the survivors of the Holocaust. On May 22, 1945, 2 weeks after the German surrender, Dr. Weizmann wrote direct to Churchill to ask that Jewish immigration be resumed. But in his reply on June 8, Churchill informed Weizmann that there could be no possibility of the question being effectively considered until the proposed peace conference. Wow. Any excuse, even Churchill. Weizmann was appalled by this decision, of course, and now I am too. by this decision to delay what was for the survivors of the Holocaust a matter of urgency. On June 13th, he replied to Churchill that the contents of Churchill's letter had come as a great shock to him. President Truman's wish that the survivors of the concentration camps should be allowed into Palestine had already led to protests not only from the Arab states, but also from the Congress in India. Will the Muslims ever cease? They lost the war. Palestine was so effectively barred to Jewish refugees, and the American quota system was still rigidly enforced. Minutiae numbers of people were allowed in. The exodus of Polish Jews did not end at Berlin. All over Europe, Zionist emissaries were organizing escape routes to Palestine. The struggle now began in Palestine and in Europe between the British government and the Jews, a struggle marked by increasing bitterness and extremism on both sides. The British determined to halt the now swelling tide of illegal immigration from, I quote unquote, immigration from liberated Europe to mandatory Palestine, went so far as to return captured immigrants from the waters of the eastern Mediterranean to which they had sailed, to the displacement camps in Germany from which they had fled. In Europe itself, at the frontier crossings between Austria and Italy, British troops halted concentration camp survivors who were on their way to the Adriatic and to Palestine and held them in former prisoner of war camps. Inside Palestine, the Irgun, Jewish terrorist organization headed by Menachem Begin, reacted by attacking British military installations, and as death sentences and reprisals increased, the tension, acts of increasing desperation marked their efforts. Force alone, the Irgun believed, could bring an end to the white paper and open Palestine to unimpeded Jewish immigration and make possible a Jewish majority and Jewish statehood. I have to empathize, in a sense, complicitous with all the killing of Jews was Britain. Even Churchill, not sticking his neck out. Since the beginning of 1945, the newspaper Manchester Guardian reported some 353 Jews had been murdered by Polish thugs. Unfortunately, it added, anti-Semitism is still prevalent. Large numbers of Polish Jews are in fact succeeding in leaving Poland, their objective being the British and American zones in Germany and Austria en route for Italy, and thence by illegal means to Palestine. The great majority of the Jews wanted to leave Poland. Of course, they looked upon Palestine as their traditional home, the cradle of their race and the center of their faith. Despite British efforts to prevent the Polish Jews from setting out on the hazardous road to Palestine, the situation inside Poland itself made flight inevitable. 9 months had passed since VE Day, 9 months, and there the Jews, British, and American liberators had made no move to accept them in their own countries. They had gathered them into centers in Germany, fed them and clothed them, and then apparently believed that their Christian duty had been accomplished. They, the Jews, knew that far away in Palestine there was a national home willing and eager to receive them and to give them a chance of rebuilding their lives, not as aliens in a foreign state, but as Hebrews in their own country. In the name of Christianity, in the name of Christ, they thought their duty was accomplished. The hunger strike by Jews on 2 ships was in fact successful on May 8th. The Dov Hos and the Elihu Golomb sailed from Palestine. Their 1,014 passengers having been granted immigration certificates from the month's quota. Anglo-American Committee report. The Anglo-American Committee published its report on 1st May 1946. Among its recommendations were the end to the land purchase restrictions on the 1939 White Paper, an immediate grant of 100,000 immigration certificates to the Jewish survivors. The Jews of Palestine were bitterly disappointed that their hope of statehood was not endorsed by the committee, which recommended a continuation of the mandate. Frustration now overcame and indeed almost overwhelmed the Jews of Palestine. On June 16th, the military arm of the Jewish agency of the Haganah blew up 9 bridges and damaged the Haifa railway workshops. On June 29th, the British retaliated, sealing buildings, arresting 3,000 Jews, including most of the senior members of the Zionist executive. Meanwhile, the pogroms in Poland continued. In Poland, 42 Jews were killed. Within 24 hours of the Kielce program, more than 5,000 Jews fled from all over Poland. They were harassed wherever they went. These new refugees also turned towards Palestine. In Palestine itself, the arrest of the Zionist leaders had created a ferment of discontent. Within 3 weeks, That despair reached a climax with, on July 22nd, the blowing up of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem by members of the Irgun. 91 people were killed, British administrators working in the hotel, Arabs and Jews. Winston Churchill reverses his support for the Jews' settlement in Palestine en masse. Britain, said Churchill, should not be in too great a hurry to give up the idea that European Jews may live in the countries where they belong, and he continued, I must say that I had no idea when the war came to an end of the horrible massacres which had occurred, but the millions and millions that have been slaughtered after the war, that dawned on us gradually after the struggle was over. But if all these immense millions have been killed and slaughtered, there must be a certain amount of living room for their survivors. Wow. And there must be an inheritance in properties to which they can lay claim. Are we not to hope that some tolerance will be established in racial matters in Europe? But it wasn't. And that will be some law reigning by which, at any rate, a portion of the property of these great numbers will not be taken away from them. It is quite clear, however, that this crude idea of letting all the Jews of Europe go into Palestine has no relation either to the problem of Europe or to the problem which arises in Palestine. It always has and it always will. Churchill then referred to the King David explosion. It is perfectly clear, he told the Commons, that Jewish warfare directed against the British in Palestine will, if protracted, automatically release us from all obligations to persevere as well as destroy the inclination to make further efforts in British hearts. And yet, Churchill added, we must not be in a hurry to turn aside from large causes which we have carried far. How far did you carry it? You didn't follow through. For many Jews, Churchill's speech, and in particular his remark about the absurdity of allowing the Holocaust survivors to go to Palestine, was a bitter disappointment. The history of British hesitations with regard to the war crimes trials reveals the extent to which the Jews, despite the enormity of their sufferings, this goes on, were not considered either a nation or a people who, having suffered as such, deserve the support of the existing Allied states. Look at Israel today. Number 4 economy in the world. Pretty much on their own. They get help, only when their progress looked for, the Arabs couldn't continue to stop Israel because she accomplished success on her own. In October 1946, 11 new Jewish settlements were established in the Negev in a single night, aimed at ensuring that the Negev would be included within the boundaries of the state. 2 weeks earlier, on October 1, Weizmann had gone to see Bevin at the Foreign Office to ask Bevin to agree to some form of partition, at first put forward 10 years earlier by the Peel commissioners. But Bevin replied the Arabs would not accept partition. Was he to force it on them with British bayonets? The British wouldn't do anything. Bevin also spoke of the growing anti-Semitic under the skin as there exists now. Wow. Consider. The 22nd Zionist Congress moves towards justifying armed resistance in Palestine. 22nd Zionist Congress opened in Basel on 9 December 1946. The new Negev settlements, Weizmann told the delegates, have in my deepest conviction a far greater weight than 100 speeches about resistance, especially when the speeches are made in New York, while the proposed resistance is to be made in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Weizmann did not minimize the cause of Jewish bitterness. Indeed, his speech contained a powerful reproach of Britain's white paper policy for, as he told the delegate in bitter tones, whenever a new country was about to come under Gestapo rule, we asked that the gates of the national home be opened for saving as many as possible of our people from the gas chambers. Our entreaties fell on deaf ears. It seemed that the white paper was more sacred for some people than life itself, and it was. Sometimes we were told that our exclusion from Palestine was necessary in order to do justice to a nation endowed with 7 independent territories covering 1 million square miles. At other times we were informed that the admission of our refugees might endanger military security during the war. It was easier to doom the Jews of Europe to a certain death than to evolve a technique for overcoming such difficulties. When human need, the instinct of self-preservation, collided with the white paper, the result was the Struma, the Patria, and the Moratorius, not mercy for the Jews. These were stern words describing a situation which many of the delegates regarded as a justification for armed resistance.